When Grace was born, the small hut was filled with the sound of her cries, but her mother, Margaret, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She was weak from childbirth, and the midwife, Mama Esther, gently wrapped the newborn in a worn cloth and handed her to Margaret with a warm smile. "It's a girl, Margaret," Mama Esther said softly. But as Margaret tried to lift her head to look at her baby, a deep sense of dread settled in her heart. There was no joy, only a heavy silence. The baby wasn't looking at her. She wasn't responding to movement. Mama Esther, sensing something was amiss, waved her hand in front of the baby's face. She sighed deeply and turned to Margaret. "She does not see," she said. Margaret felt her chest tighten as the weight of the words hit her. Blind. Her little girl was blind. She stared at the baby in her arms, her tiny, innocent face, her hands moving aimlessly. The silence in the room was deafening. Outside, Margaret could hear the whispers of the village women, waiting anxiously for news. The gossip would spread like wildfire. A cursed child, a bad omen. Who will marry a blind girl? She'll bring nothing but suffering to her mother. Margaret's heart pounded, her body trembling with fear. Her husband had passed away months ago, leaving her alone to face the world. The weight of her situation was unbearable. As she sat with her baby in the quiet of that small hut, Margaret realized that she was no longer just a mother. She was now a woman ostracized by her community. Alone, with no one to turn to for help. That night, as Grace cried softly beside her, Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The moon hung high in the sky as Margaret left the hut, clutching her baby in her arms. Her heart raced with each step she took through the dense forest. The cries of her child pierced the night, but Margaret kept moving, her legs heavy, her mind clouded by fear and shame. She stopped by an old tree, looked around in a desperate search for someone to stop her, but no one came. Tears streamed down her face as she gently placed her baby on a soft patch of grass. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't do this." She turned away, unable to face the child she had brought into the world, and ran into the night, leaving behind the one soul who needed her most. That night, as the moon climbed high in the sky, Margaret's heart weighed heavy with a decision she knew would change everything. She could hear Grace's soft cries beside her, but they didn't bring the usual instinct to comfort that every mother should feel. Instead, they echoed in her ears like a harsh reminder of the weight of her reality. The world was already turning its back on her, and in that moment, it felt like there was no other choice. Margaret's eyes were swollen from crying, her body weak with exhaustion, but the pressure of her circumstances pushed her forward. She couldn't see a way out. The village had already begun to turn on her. The women, who had once been friendly, now spoke in hushed tones behind her back. The whispers had begun before she even gave birth. "A blind child," they would say. "A cursed one. She'll never amount to anything. A burden. A disgrace." Margaret knew their words would only grow louder, that her life and the life of her daughter would be nothing but a source of pity and judgment. No one would help her. No one would accept them, and she knew that she could never raise a child like this on her own. As she walked through the thick forest, her legs felt like stone, each step harder than the last. The trees seemed to close in on her as if the forest itself was swallowing her. The cries of her baby grew louder in the stillness, but they did nothing to sway Margaret's resolve. She had to keep moving. She didn't want to. She couldn't bear the thought of a life where her daughter would face nothing but rejection. Margaret knew, deep down, that this wasn't a choice she could take back. But fear, shame, and the loneliness of her situation made it feel like the only option. She stopped near an old tree, her breath shallow and quick. She looked around, half hoping that someone would come out of the shadows, someone to tell her that this wasn't the right thing to do. But there was nothing. The forest was quiet except for the cries of her baby. The fear in Margaret's chest tightened as she knelt down and gently placed Grace on a patch of soft grass. She stared at her for a moment, her heart breaking with every breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I can't do this." The tears came fast and hard, but she couldn't stay. She turned away, squeezing her eyes shut, and walked into the night, leaving behind the one person who needed her the most. The baby's cries echoed in the distance, a sound that would stay with Margaret forever. It was a quiet night when Dr. Samuel rode back from a neighboring village, tired from a long day of treating sick children. The gentle sway of his horse beneath him was a comforting rhythm, but the stillness of the night was interrupted by a faint sound in the distance, a baby's cry. At first he thought it was his imagination, But as he listened more closely, the cries became louder, desperate, and full of sorrow. His heart clenched as he turned his horse in the direction of the sound. The forest was thick with shadows, the moonlight barely piercing through the canopy of trees. He followed the sound, his horse's hooves crunching against the underbrush until he reached a large tree. There, lying on the ground, wrapped in a torn cloth, was a tiny bundle. His heart sank as he dismounted quickly, his hands trembling as he approached. He could see the child's frail form, her tiny body weak from hunger and abandonment. He gently picked her up, his trained hands recognizing the signs of starvation and neglect. "Who would leave you here, little one?" he whispered softly as he cradled her in his arms. The baby stopped crying for a brief moment as though sensing the kindness in his touch. His heart ached for the helpless child, abandoned and alone in the woods. He couldn't just leave her there, he thought. He had to do something. With great care, Dr. Samuel mounted his horse again, holding the fragile baby close to him. The ride back to his home felt longer than usual, the weight of the child in his arms a constant reminder of the cruelty she had faced. When he finally arrived home, just as the first light of dawn began to break, his wife, Mary, was waiting by the fire. She looked up in surprise as she saw her husband with the baby in his arms. "Samuel, whose child is this?" Mary asked, rushing toward him. Her eyes were wide with concern, and she immediately reached out to take the baby from his arms. Doctor. Samuel sighed deeply, a mixture of exhaustion and sadness in his voice. "She was abandoned in the forest. Someone left her to die," he said quietly. Mary gasped, her hand over her mouth in shock. She gently took the baby, her eyes softening as she looked at the tiny face. "She's beautiful," she murmured, her voice full of tenderness. Dr. Samuel smiled faintly. "I want to call her Grace," he said, his voice firm with resolve, "because despite everything, she has survived. She's brought light into our lives." And so, Grace became part of their family. Though she was blind, Dr. Samuel and Mary gave her the love and care she needed. She grew up in a warm home, surrounded by affection, and with each passing day, it became clear that Grace was not just a survivor, she was a blessing. Grace grew up in a home filled with love, far from the cruel fate her biological mother had set for her. Despite being blind, she never allowed her disability to define her. Dr. Samuel and Mary provided a world where she could thrive. The couple nurtured Grace with patience and care, teaching her to use her other senses to experience the world in ways others often overlooked. From a young age, Grace learned to rely on her hands, feeling her way through the house, memorizing every corner, every texture. She could hear the smallest sounds that most people missed: the rustling of leaves outside, the hum of a distant bird, and even the softest footstep on the floor. As the years passed, Grace became more confident. She had a sense of the world around her that was sharper than most, not just because of her heightened senses, but because she understood what it meant to be different. Her blindness didn't hinder her from living a full life. She didn't see the world as a place of limitation. Instead, she embraced it, finding beauty in what others took for granted. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her face, the soft breeze in her hair, and the texture of flowers in the garden. She may not have seen the vibrant colors of the world, but she understood their essence, her heart connecting to the earth in a way that few could. One morning, Mary called Grace inside from the yard. Grace, who had been playing with the garden's flowers, turned her head at the sound of her mother's voice and smiled. Over the years, she had memorized every inch of their home, and she could navigate it with ease, walking confidently from room to room. She was no longer the fragile little girl left in the forest, but a young woman with strength, resilience, and a deep sense of self. "You called, Mama?" Grace asked, her voice full of warmth. Mary, standing in the doorway, smiled and reached for Grace's hand. "I have something for you," she said gently. "I want you to learn to play this." She placed a small wooden flute in Grace's hand. Grace ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling its texture. She had always loved music, even though she couldn't see it. Mary had taught her that music wasn't just something you see with your eyes, it was something you could feel with your heart. That day, Grace sat outside, pressing the flute to her lips. At first, the notes were uneven, sharp, and broken, but she didn't give up. Each day she practiced, and slowly, the sound became sweeter, more beautiful. The music that came from her flute wasn't just a melody. It was a reflection of her spirit, a testament to her journey from abandonment to belonging, from darkness to light. One evening, as Dr. Samuel watched Grace play her flute in the yard, a thought crossed his mind, a thought he hadn't allowed himself to entertain until now. What if Grace could see? The more he observed her, the more he noticed how her other senses seemed to compensate for her blindness. She had an uncanny ability to navigate the world around her, as if her perception was sharper than that of anyone else. But Dr. Samuel had always accepted her blindness as part of who she was, never questioning it. Yet now, something about her movements, the way she looked around as if searching for something, made him wonder. He had treated countless patients over the years, many of whom had conditions that seemed impossible to overcome. But Grace was different. She'd been blind since birth, and he had always accepted that reality, never imagining that there could be a possibility of restoring her sight. Still, the idea nagged at him. Could her blindness be reversible? Could something have been missed all these years? That night, Dr. Samuel sat up late in his study, poring through old medical textbooks and research articles. His mind raced with questions, and with every new piece of information he uncovered, his hope grew. What if there was a way to help Grace see the world, to give her the gift that so many took for granted? He couldn't ignore the possibility. He had to find out if it was true. The next morning, he took Grace to his clinic. His hands shook as he conducted test after test. His mind focused solely on the possibility that her blindness wasn't permanent. When the results came in, his heart skipped a beat. There was hope. Grace's blindness could be treated with surgery. It wasn't going to be easy, and the cost was high, but it was possible. For the first time in years, Dr. Samuel felt a rush of excitement mixed with fear. He had spent so many years as a doctor, saving lives and offering healing, but this was different. This was Grace, the little girl he had raised, the one he loved like his own. The cost of the surgery was a hurdle. Dr. Samuel knew they didn't have the funds. The clinic, while successful, couldn't cover such a large expense. But he wasn't ready to give up. He would do whatever it took to give Grace the chance to see. No matter how hard the road ahead might be, he couldn't let her live in darkness when there was a chance to change it. After weeks of anxious waiting, the day finally came for Grace's surgery. Dr. Samuel and Mary were both filled with nervous anticipation, their hearts heavy with hope and fear. The operation was risky, but it was the only chance Grace had to see the world. They had spent everything they could spare to pay for the procedure, even when they had no guarantees. But now, there was nothing left to do but wait and pray. As Grace was wheeled into the operating room, Dr. Samuel's hands shook. He had been through many surgeries in his life, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a patient. This was his daughter, the little girl he had raised and loved as his own. The thought that something could go wrong, that he could lose her, was unbearable. He kissed her forehead before the nurses took her away, his voice quiet as he whispered words of encouragement. "You'll be okay, Grace. You're strong. I'll be here waiting." Mary sat in the waiting room, clutching her rosary tightly in her hands. Her eyes were red from crying, her mind racing with worry. She couldn't stop thinking about the life they had built together, the love they had poured into Grace. The idea of losing her, of watching her go through this painful process, only to come out with nothing, was too much to bear. She wiped her eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. She had to believe that this was the right thing, that it was meant to be. But the fear lingered, gnawing at her heart. Hours seemed to drag on, each minute stretching out longer than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors to the operating room opened. Dr. Samuel stepped out, his face unreadable, but there was a sense of quiet relief in his eyes. Mary jumped to her feet, her breath caught in her throat. "Samuel, how is she?" Dr. Samuel took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the moment. "The surgery was successful," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She's going to be okay. She'll be able to see." Tears filled Mary's eyes as she rushed to him, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank God." 2 days later, the bandages were ready to come off. Grace lay in the hospital bed, her tiny fingers gripping Mary's hand. The room was filled with tension, but the love and anticipation in the air were undeniable. As the nurse gently removed the cloth from around Grace's eyes, Dr. Samuel and Mary held their breath. "Grace," Dr. Samuel said softly, his voice trembling with excitement. "Can you see me?" Grace blinked, her dark brown eyes scanning the room. The seconds felt like hours as she processed the world around her. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. "Mama, Papa, I see you," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Mary's heart swelled with joy as she hugged her daughter tightly. For the first time, Grace could see her mother's face clearly, truly see her, as she had never been able to before. And for the first time, Dr. Samuel felt like he had truly given Grace a second chance at life, a gift that would change everything. Years passed, and Grace grew up into a strong, confident young woman. She was no longer the fragile, helpless child abandoned in the forest, but a vibrant, full-of-life young lady who had defied every expectation. Despite her blindness, she had found her place in the world, surrounded by the love and care of Dr. Samuel and Mary, who had raised her as their own. Grace had a remarkable way of navigating through life, learning to use her other senses in ways that others couldn't even imagine. She could hear the smallest sounds and feel the world around her with a deep understanding that made her not just survive but truly live. But one day, as Grace grew older, a quiet unease began to settle in her heart. She'd always known that she was different, that her life had been shaped by the love and sacrifice of her parents, but the question of who she really was, of where she came from, kept nagging at her. It was as if there was a piece of her story that had been hidden, a part of herself that was locked away. One evening, after dinner, Grace overheard her parents talking. She had been on her way downstairs when she paused at the top of the stairs, her curiosity pulling her closer to the conversation. The words she overheard shattered her world. Dr. Samuel and Mary were speaking in hushed tones, but Grace could hear them clearly. They were talking about her biological mother, the woman who had abandoned her in the forest all those years ago. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she listened to their words, the shock and confusion hitting her like a wave. She had always known she was adopted, but hearing the truth of how her real mother had left her to die was more than she could process in that moment. The anger and hurt rushed through her like a storm. How could her real mother have done something so cruel? How could anyone abandon their child in the woods, leaving them to fend for themselves? The pain in her heart was overwhelming. Grace stumbled back to her room, locking the door behind her. She sank to the floor, tears pouring from her eyes as the memories of her childhood, her love for Dr. Samuel and Mary, suddenly felt like a lie. Her entire identity seemed to be crumbling before her. For hours, Grace lay awake, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. Who was she really? Why had her mother left her? Why hadn't Dr. Samuel and Mary told her the truth sooner? The feeling of betrayal, the anger at the woman who had given her life, was overwhelming. But more than that, she felt lost. The life she had built with her parents suddenly felt like a fragile facade, shattered by the harsh reality of her past. By morning, Grace knew she had to find answers. She couldn't live with the unknown anymore. She had to know the truth about the woman who had given her life, even if it meant confronting the pain that would come with it. Days passed after Grace overheard the conversation between Dr. Samuel and Mary, but the storm in her heart had not calmed. She had forgiven them for keeping the truth from her, but the hurt from learning about her biological mother was more than she could handle. Despite the warmth and security she had with Dr. Samuel and Mary, she couldn't shake the question: why did her mother leave her? Was she truly abandoned because she was blind? The thoughts twisted in her mind like a never-ending spiral. Grace locked herself away in her room, trying to process everything, but the more she thought about it, the more her feelings of betrayal grew. Her whole life had been built on love, on the belief that Dr. Samuel and Mary were her true parents. Yet now, a part of her felt as if she had been living a lie. The world she had known safe and full of affection seemed to be built on secrets. Still, one truth remained. Dr. Samuel and Mary had loved her from the moment they found her, and they gave her everything she needed to thrive. The more she thought about her life, the more she realized that the love they gave her was real, and it was stronger than anything her biological mother could have offered. Grace took a deep breath and made a decision. It was time to confront the past, to face the woman who had abandoned her, to seek the truth, and perhaps find some peace in the process. With resolve in her heart, she decided to find her birth mother, not to take her back into her life, but to understand the reasons behind her painful abandonment. She knew that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean allowing the past to shape her future, but it did mean giving herself the chance to heal. When Grace met her biological mother, Margaret, face to face, it was clear that neither woman was the same person as the one from years ago. Margaret had changed. She was broken, regretful, and deeply sorrowful for the decision she had made. She didn't expect Grace to welcome her with open arms, but she longed for her forgiveness, knowing that her past mistakes would forever haunt her. For Grace, The journey to forgiveness was not easy. It was filled with anger, sorrow, and confusion, but it was also a journey of healing. Grace had to realize that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past, but about finding peace in the present. It was about letting go of the bitterness that had taken root in her heart for so long. In the end, Grace forgave Margaret. But she made it clear Dr. Samuel and Mary were her parents, the people who had loved her, raised her, and given her a future. She didn't need to return to the past to move forward. She simply needed to let go of the pain and allow herself to heal. The forgiveness she gave Margaret was a gift, not to her biological mother, but to herself, allowing Grace to truly live free of the burden of resentment. This story is a powerful reminder that the past, no matter how painful, does not define who we are. We are defined by the choices we make today, by the love we give and receive, and by the strength we find to forgive. Whether it's forgiving others or forgiving ourselves, it's a process that takes time, but it's one that ultimately sets us free. Just as Grace learned to embrace the love of her real parents, we too can find healing by choosing forgiveness, not just for others, but for our own peace of mind and heart. In the end, love and forgiveness have the power to transform even the darkest of pasts.